The fluorescent lights of the Shell station hummed with a low-frequency vibration that most people are too busy to notice. I notice everything. It's a byproduct of 30 years in HVAC. If you don't hear the slight rattle in the blower motor or the faint hiss of a leaking coil, you aren't doing your job. I sat in my truck, the engine ticking as it cooled, and watched the blue sedan parked at pump 4. It was angled haphazardly, the way people park when they are too tired to care about the lines. I saw Lucas first. He was slumped against the driver's side window, his mouth slightly open, the gray light of the station making his skin look like unbaked dough. He looked diminished. In the back seat, tucked into a faded plastic carrier, my grandson was a small, unmoving lump beneath a fleece blanket. The sight didn't make me angry, not yet. Anger is a spike in pressure that blows a seal. What I felt was a steady, calculated shift in my internal thermostat. I checked my watch. 2:14 a.m., I stepped out of my truck, the evening air smelling of damp pavement and cheap gasoline. My shoes made a rhythmic, solid sound on the concrete. I didn't sneak. I don't believe in sneaking. I walked to the driver's side door of the sedan and tapped on the glass with my wedding ring. The metallic clink, clink, clink was precise. Lucas jolted, his eyes wide and unfocused, scrambling for a second before he recognized me. He rolled the window down, and the smell of stale coffee and unwashed clothes drifted out. "Dad?" His voice was thin, cracked at the edges. "Unlock the door, Lucas," I said. My voice was the one I used when a junior tech told me a furnace was a total loss without checking the thermocouple first. Level. Irrefutable. He hesitated, then the locks clicked. I opened the car door and said, "Come with me." He didn't argue. He got out of the car like a man who had forgotten how his own legs worked. I walked to the back, unbuckled the carrier, and lifted my grandson out. The boy stirred, a small sigh escaping him, but he didn't wake. I handed the carrier to Lucas and gestured toward my truck. We left the sedan sitting there at pump 4. I didn't care about the gas or the car. I cared about the trajectory. Inside the truck, with the heater blowing a gentle, silent stream of air, I didn't ask him what happened. I knew what happened. I had seen the way Talia's parents, the Calders, looked at my son at Thanksgiving. They looked at him like a scratch on a mahogany table, something that could be buffed out or replaced if it became too unsightly. Evan Calder dealt in luxury real estate, a world built on the illusion of perfection. Lucas, with his rideshare shifts and his honest, tired hands, was an imperfection in the Calder brand. "The locks are different," Lucas whispered, staring out at the dark road as I pulled away. "I went to get groceries. When I got back, the key wouldn't turn. Talia wouldn't come to the door. Her father was there. He told me through the glass that I should go find a motel until the paperwork was finalized." "What paperwork, Lucas?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the road. He called it a temporary separation of assets and custody, said it was for the best, said I was unstable because I was working 20 hours a day to pay for a house I thought we owned. He let out a jagged laugh that sounded like gravel in a gearbox. "I've been in the car for 2 days, Dad. I didn't want to call you. I felt like a failure." I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the textured leather beneath my palms. I thought about the house. I had provided the down payment, 3 decades of overtime and careful saving, given as a gift to help them start their lives. I had signed the checks. I had vetted the inspectors. I had been told it was a family investment. "You aren't a failure," I said. "You were just playing a game where the other side had the rulebook and you didn't. That changes tonight." I drove him to my place, a small 2-bedroom bungalow that smelled of lemon wax and old blueprints. I put the baby in the guest room, tucked him in with a precision that comes from years of handling delicate components. When I came back to the kitchen, Lucas was sitting at the table, his head in his hands. "They have lawyers, Dad. Evan has a firm on retainer that handles his commercial leases. They'll bury me in motions. I can't even afford a consultation fee right now." I went to the pantry, moved aside a box of filters, and pulled out a heavy accordion file. I set it on the table with a dull thud. I pulled out a chair and sat across from him. I didn't look tired. I felt incredibly awake, the kind of clarity you get when you finally find the source of a persistent vibration in a high-rise HVAC system. "Evan Calder thinks in terms of leverage," I said, opening the file. "He thinks because he wears a $3,000 suit and speaks at Chamber of Commerce luncheons, he is the one who decides when a contract is over. He thinks people like us are just part of the infrastructure. We're supposed to work quietly in the background and stay out of sight." I flipped through the pages until I found the deed of trust for the house. I slid it across the table. "Look at the signature line on the secondary rider," I said. Lucas squinted at the paper. "That's your name and Evan's." "Evan wanted to be helpful," I said, a small dry smile touching my lips. He suggested we co-sign the bridge loan to ensure the interest rate stayed low. He thought he was being clever, tying his name to the property to ensure he had a say in how it was maintained. But he forgot one thing. And I don't sign anything without a contingency clause. I've dealt with too many shady contractors to trust a handshake. I pointed to a paragraph near the bottom, written in the kind of dense legalese that most people skip over. This clause dictates that in the event of a change in residency status for the primary inhabitants without the unanimous consent of all signatories, the loan is subject to immediate recall or a transfer of title to the primary financier. That's me, Lucas. I am the primary financier. Lucas looked up, a spark of something returning to his eyes. So, he can't kick me out? Oh, he already did, I said, my voice dropping an octave. And that was his first mistake. He broke the residency covenant. By changing those locks and preventing you from entering, he triggered a default. He thinks he's erasing you. In reality, he just handed me the keys to his daughter's front door. I leaned back, the plastic of the kitchen chair creaking slightly. I thought about Marlene Calder, with her pearls and her habit of talking over me as if I were a waiter who had forgotten the water. I thought about the way they had orchestrated this, likely over expensive steaks and chilled wine, planning the removal of my son from their pristine family tree. They thought they were dealing with a repairman. What do we do now? Lucas asked. Now, I said, we let them sleep. They'll wake up tomorrow feeling very powerful. They'll think they've won. They'll probably go to brunch. And while they're deciding between the eggs, Benedict, and the smoked salmon, I'm going to start dismantling their world. I stood up and walked to the window. The sun was beginning to gray the horizon, a cold, pale light that offered no warmth. I could see the silhouette of my tools in the back of my truck. Every wrench, every gauge, every piece of equipment had its place. I knew how to fix things that were broken, but more importantly, I knew how to take things apart so they could never be put back together. Go to sleep, Lucas, I said without turning around. Use the master bedroom. I'll be in the office. Dad, you're not going to do anything reckless, are you? I turned then, giving him a long, steady look. I thought about the gas station, the sight of my grandson in the back of a car because his own home had been stolen by paperwork and ego. I thought about the quiet, calculated cruelty of the Calders. I don't do reckless, I said. Reckless is for people who react. I'm not reacting, Lucas. I'm correcting a malfunction. I waited until I heard the bedroom door close before I sat down at my desk. I pulled out my laptop and a fresh legal pad. I didn't need a lawyer yet. I needed a list. I started with the names of every contractor Evan Calder used for his properties. I knew half of them. I had sold equipment to the other half. I knew who was overextended, who was looking for a better deal, and who owed me a favor from the winter of 14 when I stayed up 48 hours straight to fix a boiler in a low-income housing complex. I began to type. The sound of the keys was a sharp, rhythmic staccato in the quiet house. Click, click, click. It was the sound of a countdown. By 6 a.m., I had a map of the Calder family's vulnerabilities. It wasn't just the house. It was the reputation. It was the flow of money. It was the way they viewed the world as a series of assets to be managed. They had treated my son like an asset to be liquidated. They had treated my grandson like a piece of collateral. I closed the laptop and took a sip of cold coffee. It tasted bitter, but I didn't mind. I liked the clarity of it. I looked at the phone on my desk. In 3 hours, the business day would begin. Evan Calder would walk into his office, adjust the framed photos on his desk, and feel a sense of accomplishment. He wouldn't see me coming. He wouldn't hear the hum of the machine until it was already vibrating the floorboards beneath his feet. I reached out and touched the deed of trust, my finger resting on the line where my name was signed in permanent black ink. It was a solid mark. It was a promise. They thought they had erased my family. They were about to find out that some things can't be rubbed out with a simple motion or a changed lock. Some things are built into the foundation, and if you try to pull them out, the whole structure comes down with them. I got up, went to the kitchen, and started a fresh pot of coffee. The smell began to fill the room, warm and familiar. I checked the guest room one last time. The baby was still asleep, a tiny, innocent force of nature that had no idea the world was about to change. I sat back down at the table and waited for the sun to finish rising. I wasn't in a hurry. I had all the time in the world, and that was the one thing the Calders didn't realize. When you're at the top, you're always rushing to stay there. When you're at the bottom, you can take your time. You can wait for the perfect moment to pull the pin. The clock on the wall ticked. 7 a.m. I picked up the phone. It was time to make the first call. The morning light in my office was clinical. It stripped away the shadows of the previous night and replaced them with a hard, unforgiving clarity. I sat at my desk, surrounded by the physical history of my career, rows of blue binders, tax returns from the 90s, and floor plans for commercial kitchens. To the Calders, this room would look like the lair of a man who had failed to evolve. To me, it was a command center. I spent the first 2 hours of the day making phone calls to people who don't answer their phones for lawyers or real estate moguls, but they always answer for the man who keeps their refrigeration units running on a holiday weekend. Lucas came into the kitchen around 8, looking like he hadn't slept a wink, despite the quiet of the house. He was holding the baby, who was chewing on a plastic ring with focused intensity. I watched my son's hands. They were shaking just enough to notice. He was waiting for me to tell him what the next move was, but I wasn't ready to give him the full schematics yet. In HVAC, you don't show the client the wiring diagrams until the job is finished. It only confuses them. "I'm going to the office," I said, standing up and sliding a folder into my briefcase. "I need you to stay here. Don't answer the door. If Talia calls, do not engage. If her father calls, let it go to voicemail. We are currently in a state of observation. We do not provide them with any data points." "Dad, she's been texting. She says she's worried about the baby. She says she didn't mean for it to go this far," Lucas said, his voice pleading for a reason to believe her. I walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. My grip was firm. "She had the locks changed, Lucas. You don't do that by accident. You don't not mean to hire a locksmith and stand behind a window while your husband tries to get into his own home. She's not worried about the baby. She's worried about the optics. She's worried about what her father will say if this doesn't go exactly as planned." I left him there and drove to the Calder Property Group headquarters. It was a glass and steel monstrosity on the edge of the downtown district, the kind of building that tried very hard to look important. I parked my truck right up front, the Pierce HVAC logo on the side looking delightfully out of place among the German SUVs and Italian sports cars. I didn't rush. I walked into the lobby with my briefcase, nodded to the security guard who knew me from a vent repair job 3 years ago, and took the elevator to the 5th floor. The receptionist was a young woman with a smile that had been professionally polished. She looked at my work shirt and my weathered face and immediately assumed I was there to check a thermostat. "The maintenance closet is down the hall on the left," she said, not looking up from her screen. "I'm not here for the filters, Sarah," I said. She looked up, surprised that I knew her name. I pointed to the small brass plaque on her desk. "I'm here to see Evan. Tell him Harold Pierce is here to discuss the default on the Brookside property." Her smile faltered. She knew the name Brookside. It was the crown jewel of their residential holdings, the neighborhood where Lucas and Talia's house sat. She pressed a button on her intercom, whispered something, and then looked back at me with a confused expression. "He'll see you now, through the double doors." Evan Calder's office was designed to make people feel small. High ceilings, panoramic views, and a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of prehistoric timber. He was standing by the window, his back to me, looking out over the city he thought he owned. Marlene was sitting in one of the leather armchairs, her purse perched on her lap like a weapon. They were waiting for a confrontation. They were expecting a scene. "Harold," Evan said, turning around with a practiced expression of sympathy. "I'm glad you came. We were going to call you. This is a delicate family matter, and I think it's best if the adults handle the logistics." "I agree," I said, walking to the center of the room. I didn't sit down. I stood just inside his personal space, close enough that he had to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact. "That's why I'm here, to handle the logistics." "Lucas needs help, Harold," Marlene chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial concern. "He's been under a lot of stress. Talia just wants what's best for the child. We felt a temporary separation was the only way to ensure a stable environment." "A stable environment," I repeated. I let the words hang in the air, cold and dry. "Is that why you changed the locks on a house that I legally own?" Evan's eyes flickered. He walked behind his desk, seeking the protection of the wood. "Now let's be clear. The property is in Talia and Lucas's name. I merely facilitated the management of the transition. As a co-signer, I have certain rights to protect the asset." "You have rights to the debt, Evan," I corrected him. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the deed of trust I had analyzed at 3 a.m. I laid it on his desk. "You don't have rights to the entry. By excluding one of the primary residents without a court order or a legal eviction process, you have violated the terms of the bridge loan. Paragraph 12, Section 4, unauthorized alteration of access." Evan scoffed, though it sounded a bit forced. "That's a reach, Harold. No judge is going to care about a lock change during a domestic dispute." "Maybe not," I said. "But the bank will. Specifically, the regional vice president of the bank that holds your commercial line of credit. I had a very interesting conversation with him this morning. It turns out when a co-signer on a major residential asset is found to be in technical default, it triggers a mandatory review of all their outstanding liabilities. It's a standard risk assessment protocol. The color drained from Marlene's face. She knew exactly what that meant. Evan's entire business was built on a foundation of revolving credit. If the bank started looking too closely at the cracks, the whole thing would begin to lean. "You're bluffing," Evan said, but his hand went to his tie. "I don't bluff. I calculate," I said. "I've also filed a formal motion this morning to freeze the title on the Brookside property. Until a magistrate determines the legality of your lock management, no one can sell, move, or modify that house. And since you used the equity in that house as collateral for your new development on 4th Street, I imagine that's going to be a bit of a problem for your investors." I stepped closer to the desk, leaning down so my face was only inches from his. I could smell his expensive aftershave. It smelled like desperation. "You thought you could move my son around like a piece of furniture," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You thought you could lock him out of his life and he'd just disappear because he doesn't have your bank account. But you forgot who built his foundation. I don't care about your office. I don't care about your view. I care about the fact that you made my grandson sleep in a car." "We were going to provide him with a suite at the Hyatt," Marlene snapped, her composure finally breaking. "He's not a guest in your life, Marlene," I said, turning my gaze to her. She flinched. He's family, or he was. As of this morning, you are no longer family. You are simply a pair of individuals who are currently in possession of a property I am reclaiming." I straightened up and closed my briefcase. The click of the latches was the only sound in the room. Evan was staring at the deed on his desk as if it were a venomous snake. He was realizing for the first time that he wasn't the smartest person in the room. He was realizing that he had invited a man into his world who understood exactly how to turn off the power. "What do you want?" Evan asked. His voice was no longer commanding. It was a negotiator's voice, the sound of a man trying to minimize his losses. "I don't want anything from you yet, Evan," I said, walking toward the door. "I'm just getting the site ready. I'll let you know when the real work begins." I walked out of the office and through the lobby. I felt a strange sense of peace. It was the same feeling I got when I finally identified a leak in a complex system. Once you find the hole, the rest is just labor. I drove to a small, nondescript office building on the outskirts of town. No glass, no steel, just brick, and a sign that read Vance & Associates. Marcus Vance was a family law attorney who specialized in the kind of cases people didn't talk about at country clubs. He was a man who appreciated the utility of a well-placed leverage point. We sat in his office for 2 hours. I gave him the records, the receipts, and the timeline. I showed him the evidence of the Calders' interference in the marriage and their systematic attempt to isolate Lucas from his financial assets. Marcus took notes in a precise, cramped handwriting. "This is clean, Harold," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. "They overstepped. They thought they were being protective, but they crossed into interference. I can get the emergency custody order signed by this afternoon. We'll have the locks changed back by sunset, but you know they'll fight back. Evan Calder doesn't like losing." "He's not losing yet," I said. "He's just being recalibrated. He needs to understand the scale of the error he made." "And Talia?" Marcus asked. "She's still the mother. The court will lean toward her for primary placement unless we can show a pattern of instability." "The instability isn't coming from Talia," I said. "It's coming from her parents. She's a passenger in their car. I'm going to make sure that car runs out of gas." I left the attorney's office and went to a hardware store. I bought a high-end commercial lock set and a set of heavy-duty hinges. I didn't need them yet, but I liked the weight of them in my hands. I liked the feeling of cold steel. When I got back to the house, Lucas was in the living room, watching the baby crawl across the carpet. He looked up at me, his eyes searching for a sign of hope. "The paperwork is filed," I said. "We go back to the house at 5 o'clock. A deputy will meet us there to ensure there are no complications. You're going to walk inside, you're going to take your son to his room, and you're going to stay there." "What about Talia?" "Talia will have a choice to make," I said. "She can be a wife, or she can be a Calder. She can't be both anymore. The infrastructure won't support it." I went into my office and sat down. I looked at the list I had made. The first 2 items were crossed off. The third item was Evan's primary business partner, a man named Henderson, who was notoriously sensitive about his public image. Henderson and I had a history involving a botched installation at his summer home that I had fixed for free when the original contractor disappeared. I picked up the phone. "Mr. Henderson, this is Harold Pierce. I'm calling about the HVAC specifications for the new plaza, and a few other things I think you should be aware of before the board meeting on Tuesday." I listened to his response, a faint smile on my face. The system was starting to hum. The pressure was building, and Evan Calder was about to find out what happens when you try to shut down a circuit that's still live. The sound of a drill driving a 3-inch ceramic screw into a door frame is a very specific frequency. It's the sound of permanence. At 5 o'clock sharp, as the sun began to dip behind the manicured oaks of the Brookside subdivision, I stood on the porch of my son's house. A sheriff's deputy stood 3 feet behind me, his arms crossed, his presence a silent punctuation mark at the end of a very long sentence. Lucas was in the truck with the windows rolled up, holding the boy. He wasn't ready to see the look on Talia's face yet. I was. The door opened 6 inches, caught by the security chain. Talia's face appeared in the gap, her eyes red-rimmed, her hair uncharacteristically messy. She looked at me, then at the deputy, and finally at the drill in my hand. There was no greeting. There was only the sudden, sharp intake of breath that happens when a person realizes their perimeter has been breached. "Harold, what are you doing?" Her voice was a high-pitched vibrato. "I'm changing the locks, Talia," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "The court order was served to your father's office an hour ago. It grants Lucas immediate and exclusive occupancy of the residence pending the hearing. It also specifies that you are permitted to remain, provided you do not interfere with his access or attempt to remove the child from the premises." "You can't just—" "This is my house," she stammered, looking toward the deputy for help. The deputy didn't move. He had already read the paperwork I provided, which clearly showed the property title was currently under a legal freeze due to the default I had triggered. "Actually, as of 4 o'clock, the title is in escrow," I said, stepping forward as she instinctively unlatched the chain. I walked past her into the foyer. It smelled of expensive candles and citrus cleaner, the scent of a life that had been curated rather than lived. "The house belongs to the trust now, and since I am the trustee, I am updating the security protocols." I went to work immediately. I don't believe in waiting for an emotional storm to pass before starting a repair. I removed the decorative, flimsy hardware the Calders had installed and replaced it with commercial-grade steel. Each turn of the screwdriver felt like a physical weight being lifted off my son's shoulders. Talia stood in the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear, likely listening to her father explain that his lawyers couldn't stop a primary financier from protecting a defaulting asset on a Friday evening. "He's here, Dad," she whispered into the phone, her voice cracking. "He's literally changing the doors. Do something." I didn't look at her. I looked at the alignment of the strike plate. If a door isn't hung correctly, it doesn't matter how strong the lock is. A simple pry bar can bypass the whole system. I made sure this one was perfect. When I was finished, I walked to the curb and signaled for Lucas. He emerged from the truck, carrying the boy and a small bag of essentials. He walked past me without a word, his eyes fixed on the front door. He didn't look at Talia as he went upstairs. He didn't have to. The house was no longer a cage, it was a fortress. "You're destroying this family, Harold," Talia said, walking toward me as the deputy made his exit, satisfied that no physical altercation was imminent. "No, Talia," I said, packing my tools back into the plastic chest. "I'm just removing the rot. You can stay here with your husband and your son, or you can go back to the pedestal your father built for you, but you don't get to keep both. The bridge is gone." The next morning, I didn't go to my office. Instead, I drove to the construction site of the 4th Street Plaza, Evan Calder's latest and most vulnerable project. It was a massive skeletal structure of steel beams and poured concrete, a monument to the money he had borrowed against the very house I had just reclaimed. I knew the site manager, a man named Miller, who had a permanent scowl and a habit of chewing on unlit cigars. "Pierce," Miller said, wiping grease onto a rag as I approached the trailer. "I thought you were done with commercial installs." "I'm here as a consultant, Miller," I said. I handed him a thermos of coffee I'd picked up. "I heard you're having some issues with the ventilation specs on the second tier. Something about the load-bearing calculations not matching the ductwork weight." Miller's face went pale. That was the kind of information that wasn't supposed to leave the inner circle of the engineering firm. But engineers talk to suppliers, and suppliers talk to me. "How did you hear about that?" "The industry is a small room, Miller. People hear things when the acoustics are right," I said. I leaned against the side of the trailer. "If those specs aren't rectified by the inspectors on Tuesday, this whole project hits a standstill. And I happen to know that Evan's construction loan has a penalty clause for every day the ribbon cutting is delayed." "He'll have my head," Miller muttered. "He won't have anything if the contractors pull out," I said. "And I've been talking to the guys at General Electric and the local union reps. They're a bit concerned about the stability of the Calder Group's credit line lately. They're thinking about moving their crews to the hospital project across town, better job security." I let that sink in. I wasn't making a threat. I was providing a weather report. In business, as in physics, Everything seeks the path of least resistance. If Evan Calders' project became high resistance, the money and the labor would simply flow elsewhere. By Monday, the ripples I had started turned into waves. I spent the day at my desk, watching the digital dashboard of the local real estate market. 2 of Evan's smaller residential listings were pulled. A local news outlet ran a blind item about irregularities in a major downtown development. It wasn't enough to sink him, but it was enough to make his partners uncomfortable. I was waiting for the phone to ring. When it did, at precisely 2 p.m., I didn't answer on the first ring. I let it vibrate against the mahogany of my desk, a steady, rhythmic pulse. On the 4th vibration, I picked it up. "Harold." Evan's voice was strained. The practiced calm of the executive had been replaced by the frantic energy of a man trying to plug a dozen leaks with only 10 fingers. "We need to talk. This has gone far enough. Talia is a wreck, and Henderson is asking questions that are none of his business." "Everything is Henderson's business when his name is on the bond, Evan," I said. I was looking at a diagram of a complex chiller system on my monitor. "I'm busy right now. I have a compressor to overhaul." "Don't give me that," he hissed. "I know what you're doing. You're talking to my vendors. You're whispering in the ears of my lenders. It's unprofessional, Harold. It's beneath you." "You know what was beneath me, Evan? Watching my son sleep at a gas station because you wanted to play God with his life. You wanted to see how he'd perform under pressure. Well, now you're seeing how I perform under pressure. It's a different scale entirely. What do you want? Name a figure. I'll buy out your interest in the Brookside property at a premium. Double the down payment you put in. Just stop this." I felt a cold, dry amusement. He still thought this was about money. He thought he could buy his way back to the status quo. He didn't realize that when you break a system's integrity, you can't just slap a piece of tape on it and call it a day. You have to replace the damaged components. "I don't want your money, Evan. I have plenty of my own. What I want is for you to understand that you are no longer the one who decides who stays and who goes. You're going to sit in that glass office of yours and watch as the people you've spent your life managing realize that you're just a man with a lot of debt and a very fragile ego." I hung up. I didn't wait for a rebuttal. I turned my attention back to the screen. That evening, I went back to the house. I brought a box of pizza and a new toy for the boy. The atmosphere inside had shifted. It was tense, like the air before a lightning strike. But the lock on the front door was solid. Lucas was in the kitchen, making a bottle. Talia was sitting on the sofa, staring at a muted television. She looked smaller than she had on Friday. Without her father's shadow to stand in, she seemed unsure of her own dimensions. "The bank called me today," she said, her voice hollow. "They said there's an inquiry into our joint account. They've restricted withdrawals over $500. "That's the escrow freeze," I said, sitting in the armchair opposite her. "Standard procedure when a property title is in dispute. Your father should have explained that to you." "He says you're doing this to hurt me." "I'm doing this to protect my grandson," I said. I leaned forward, my hands clasped between my knees. "Your father used you as a tool to excise Lucas from this family. He didn't care about your marriage. He cared about his brand. And now that the brand is taking a hit, he's going to start looking for someone to blame. Who do you think that's going to be, Talia?" She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. For the first time, I saw a flicker of realization in her eyes. She had always been the golden child, the one who did exactly what Evan and Marlene expected, but the gold was starting to flake off, revealing the cheap metal underneath. I stood up and walked to the kitchen. Lucas was testing the temperature of the milk on his wrist. He looked tired, but the hollow, haunted look was gone. He looked like a man who was starting to remember who he was. "Keep the doors locked, Lucas," I said. "I'm heading out. I have a meeting at the social club." "The social club? You hate that place?" Lucas said, surprised. "I do," I agreed. "But Evan loves it. And tonight is the annual Founders' Dinner. It's a very public place for a very private conversation." I drove to the club, a sprawling colonial-style building surrounded by a golf course that cost more to maintain than most people made in a decade. I wasn't a member, but I had the service contract for their entire refrigeration system. I walked through the side entrance, nodded to the kitchen staff, and made my way toward the main dining room. I stood in the shadows of the hallway, watching the room. There he was, Evan Calder, sitting at the head of a long table, surrounded by the city's elite. He was laughing, a glass of scotch in his hand, putting on a show of confidence. But I could see the way his eyes kept darting toward the door. He was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I didn't enter the room, I didn't make a scene. I simply caught the eye of the head waiter, a man I'd known for 20 years. I handed him a small, sealed envelope. "Give this to Mr. Calder during the toast," I said. Inside the envelope was a single photograph. It wasn't of a person. It was a close-up of the rusted, faulty emergency shutoff valve on the main water line of the 4th Street Plaza. It was a small, insignificant part of a multi-million-dollar project. But if that valve failed, the entire basement, and the electrical grid housed within it, would be submerged in hours. And I was the only one who knew exactly how much pressure it would take to make it snap. I walked back to my truck, the cool night air feeling like a reward. The first half of the work was done. The system was failing. Now I just had to wait for the total collapse. The Tuesday morning sun hit the glass of the 4th Street Plaza with a glare that felt personal. I sat in my truck across the street, a thermos of black coffee in the cup holder and a folder of certified mail receipts on the passenger seat. This was the day of the structural inspection, the moment where the theoretical pressure I had been applying would manifest into physical reality. In my world, you don't need a sledgehammer to bring down a wall. You just need to understand how the load is distributed. If you remove the right shim at the right time, gravity does the rest of the work for you. Evan Calder arrived at 8:45 a.m. He didn't look like the man who had been laughing at the social club 48 hours ago. His suit was wrinkled and his gait was hurried, lacking the measured stride of a man in control. He was followed by Miller and 2 men in reflective vests carrying digital levels and clipboards. They stood at the base of the skeleton, gesturing toward the second tier where the ductwork sagged like a heavy limb. I could see the tension in their silhouettes from 50 yards away. I didn't join them. I didn't need to be in the frame to be part of the picture. I simply watched as the lead inspector pointed to the very valve I had photographed. The conversation was animated. Even from behind the glass of my truck, I could see Evan's posture collapse. The inspectors weren't just looking at the valve, they were looking at the foundation. Once a doubt is planted in the mind of a city official, they look at everything through a lens of skepticism. They check the welds, the bolts, and the permits. They look for the shortcuts that a man in a hurry always takes. My phone vibrated. It was a text from Lucas. Talia's mother is at the front gate. She's demanding to see the baby. She has a lawyer with her. I put the truck in gear and pulled away from the construction site. The first phase of the morning was complete. The plaza was now a crime scene of administrative errors. Now it was time to address the domestic front. When I arrived at the Brookside house, Marlene Calder was standing on the sidewalk, her designer heels clicking on the pavement as she paced. Beside her was a man in a charcoal suit who looked like he spent more on his hair than most people spent on their mortgages. They were blocked by the heavy, commercial-grade gate I had installed over the weekend. The beauty of a gate with a digital keypad is that it doesn't care how much social standing you have. If you don't have the code, you are just another person standing on the wrong side of the bars. I stepped out of the truck, the heavy clinking of my tool belt acting as a silent announcement. Marlene turned, her face a mask of practiced indignation. "Harold, tell your son to open this gate immediately," she said, her voice tight. "This is a gross violation of our visitation rights. My attorney is prepared to file for a contempt charge right now." I walked to the keypad and wiped a smudge of dust off the screen. I didn't look at her. There are no visitation rights for grandparents in this state without a prior court-established schedule, Marlene. And since there is a standing emergency order for exclusive occupancy, you are currently loitering on private property. The attorney stepped forward, his expression neutral. "Mr. Pierce, I'm sure we can resolve this without further litigation. My client simply wants to ensure the welfare of her grandson. We have reports that the environment here has become volatile." "The only thing volatile here is the credit rating of the Calder Property Group," I said, finally turning to face them. I leaned against the gate, my arms crossed. "The boy is upstairs eating oatmeal. He's fine. Lucas is fine. The house is secure. If you want a meeting, you can schedule one through Marcus Vance. But I should warn you, his calendar is quite full. He's currently busy preparing the fraud civil suit." Marlene's eyes widened. "Fraud? What on earth are you talking about?" "The down payment," I said. "The one you told the bank was a gift from your family, while simultaneously drafting a private repayment agreement that you forced Lucas to sign under duress. That's called mortgage fraud, Marlene. And since that document was used to secure a federally insured loan, the consequences are a bit more significant than a social club snub." The attorney looked at Marlene. The silence that followed was the sound of a legal strategy evaporating. I knew about the private agreement because I had found it tucked into the back of a baby album in the attic, a sloppy mistake by a woman who thought no one would ever look behind the photos of a first birthday. "Go home, Marlene," I said, my voice dropping to that low, resonant frequency that signals the end of a negotiation. "The more you push, the more I'm going to find. And I'm very good at finding things. I've spent my life looking for leaks in places people don't even know exist." She didn't say another word. She turned and walked to her car, her attorney trailing behind her like a shadow that had lost its light. I watched them drive away before I entered the code and walked up the drive. Inside, the house was quiet. Lucas was in the living room, the boy playing with a set of wooden blocks at his feet. Talia was in the dining room, surrounded by bank statements and legal pads. She looked up when I entered, her expression one of exhaustion rather than anger. "My father just called," she said. "The 4th Street project was issued a stop work order. He's saying it's going to cost him $50,000 a day in penalties." "At least," I said, sitting down at the head of the table. I pulled a laptop out of my bag. "But that's not your concern anymore, Talia. Your concern is this." I turned the screen toward her. It was a summary of the trust I had established. "I'm moving the Brookside property into a blind trust for your son," I said. "Lucas will be the primary occupant, but neither of you will own the equity until the boy is 25. This prevents your father from using the house as collateral ever again. It also prevents you from using it as a bargaining chip." Talia stared at the screen. "You're taking the house away from us." "I'm protecting it from the people who would use it to control you," I said. "If you want to live here, you live here as a family. If you want to leave, you leave. But the walls stay. The foundation stays. This house will never be a weapon again." Lucas walked into the room, hearing the tail end of the conversation. He looked at the screen, then at me. "Is it over, Dad?" "Not yet," I said. "We still have the hearing on Thursday. That's when the temporary part of the custody order becomes a permanent arrangement, and that's when your father is going to realize that he has no seats left at the table. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in controlled collapse. Without the 4th Street project to bolster his portfolio, Evan Calders' lenders began to tighten the screws. I received word from my contacts at the bank that 3 of his commercial lines were being called in for immediate review. It was a ripple effect. Once the biggest stone falls, it knocks the others out of alignment. I spent Wednesday evening in my office, preparing for the final confrontation. I didn't feel the need for revenge in the way people do in movies. I didn't want to shout. I didn't want to gloat. I simply wanted the system to be balanced. For 30 years, I had ensured that the pressure in the lines was equal to the demand of the building. Evan Calder had tried to create a vacuum, and I was simply letting the air back in. On Thursday morning, we arrived at the courthouse. The hallways were filled with the usual hum of human misery, divorces, small claims, traffic violations. But the air around courtroom 4B was different. Evan and Marlene were already there, sitting on a wooden bench, flanked by a team of 3 lawyers. They looked like they were preparing for a siege. I walked past them with Lucas and Marcus Vance. I didn't look at Evan, but I could feel his gaze on the back of my neck. It was a hot, desperate heat. The hearing was brief. Marcus presented the evidence of the lock change, the mortgage irregularities, and the systematic attempts by the Calders to interfere with the domestic stability of the household. Evan's lawyers tried to argue that their actions were protective and financially motivated, but the judge, a woman who looked like she had seen every version of a meddling in-law in the book, wasn't interested in their definitions. The court finds that the actions taken by the maternal grandparents were not only outside the scope of the law, but were actively detrimental to the stability of the minor child, she said, her voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. The emergency custody order is hereby made permanent. The residency of the child shall remain at the Brookside property under the primary care of the father. Any contact by the maternal grandparents shall be at the discretion of the father and shall be supervised by a third-party agency. The gavel hit the desk with a finality that made Marlene gasp. It was the sound of a door being bolted from the inside. As we filtered out of the courtroom, Evan intercepted me in the hallway. His lawyers tried to hold him back, but he pushed through. He was red-faced, his breathing shallow. "You think you've won, Harold," he hissed. "You've ruined my reputation. You've stalled my biggest project. You've turned my daughter against me. What do you have to show for it?" I stopped and looked at him. I noticed the way his pulse was visible in his neck, the way his expensive suit didn't quite hide the fact that he was shaking. He was a man who had lost his leverage, and he didn't know how to function without it. "I have my family," I said quietly, "and I have the peace of knowing that you will never be able to touch them again. You spent your life building a house of cards, Evan. I just provided the breeze." I walked away, leaving him standing in the middle of the corridor. I didn't look back to see if he was following. I didn't need to. I could hear the sound of his lawyers whispering to him, the sound of damage control starting too late to matter. When we got to the parking lot, the air felt lighter. The sun was warm, and the city hummed with its usual indifference to the dramas of the individuals within it. Lucas turned to me, his hand on the door of his truck. "Is that it? Is he gone?" "He's not gone," I said, leaning against my own truck. "People like Evan don't just disappear, but he's contained. He's in a box of his own making, and the lid is heavy. He'll be too busy trying to keep his company from sinking to worry about what's happening in your living room. Thank you, Dad. Don't thank me, I said. Just keep the filters clean, Lucas. Pay attention to the sounds the house makes. If something feels off, don't wait for it to break. Fix it while it's still small. I watched him drive away, heading back to the house I had reclaimed for him. I sat in my truck for a long time, not moving, not thinking. I just listened to the engine cool, the ticking of the metal a steady, comforting rhythm. The first 4 acts were done. The repair was nearly complete, but there was one last piece of equipment that needed to be decommissioned, one last move to ensure that the pressure stayed exactly where I wanted it. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I had memorized years ago. It's Harold. I'm ready to talk about the acquisition of the Calder holdings. Yes, all of them. Let's start with the 4th Street Plaza. I put the truck in gear and pulled out of the lot. The sun was high now, casting short, sharp shadows. The work wasn't over, but the direction was clear. And in my business, the direction of the flow is everything. The silence of my workshop is a different kind of quiet than the silence of a courthouse. In the workshop, the air is thick with the scent of lubricating oil and cold iron, and the stillness is purposeful. I spent Friday morning at my workbench, meticulously cleaning the internal components of a specialized pressure regulator. It's a delicate process. If you rush the cleaning, you leave behind microscopic grit that will eventually cause the valve to seize. Patience is the only tool that matters when you are working with systems under high tension. By noon, the news had hit the local business wire. The Calder Property Group was officially restructuring. In the language of the high-rise offices, that's a polite way of saying the hull had been breached and the water was rising faster than the pumps could work. The 4th Street Plaza project was being shopped around to secondary investors at a steep discount just to cover the immediate penalties. Evan was hemorrhaging liquidity, and his partners were stepping back into the shadows, unwilling to be splashed by the fallout of his technical defaults. I wiped my hands on a shop rag and picked up the phone. It was time to invite them over. I didn't call Evan's office. I called his personal cell phone. He answered on the first ring, his voice sounding like it had been scraped across a concrete floor. He didn't even say hello. He just breathed into the receiver, waiting for me to dictate the terms of the next hour. My house. 7 o'clock, I said. Bring Marlene. Bring Talia. We're going to finalize the transition. What transition, Harold? You've taken everything, he rasped. Not everything, Evan. You still have your pride. I'm here to help you part with that, too. It's a heavy thing to carry when you're trying to stay afloat. I hung up before he could argue. I spent the afternoon preparing the dining room. I didn't set a table for a meal. I set a table for a closing. I placed 3 chairs on one side and a single heavy oak chair on the other. In the center of the table, I laid out a series of folders, the trust documents, the bank statements, the revised deed, and a final thick envelope that contained the buyout offer for the 4th Street Plaza. I had spent the last 48 hours coordinating with a private equity group that I had serviced for a decade. They provided the capital, I provided the intelligence. Together, we were the salvage crew. At exactly 7 o'clock, a black sedan pulled into my driveway. I watched from the window as they stepped out. Evan looked frail, his suit hanging off shoulders that seemed to have shrunk. Marlene was rigid, her face set in a mask of frozen arrogance that was starting to crack at the corners. Talia walked behind them, her eyes fixed on the ground. She looked like someone who had finally realized the pedestal she had been sitting on was actually a cage. I opened the door before they could knock. I didn't offer a handshake, I didn't offer a drink. I simply gestured toward the dining room. Sit, I said. They sat. The air in the room was heavy, pressurized by the weight of things unsaid. Evan looked at the folders on the table, his eyes darting from one label to the next. He was looking for a way out, a loophole, a hidden valve he could turn to regain control. He wouldn't find one. I had spent 30 years ensuring that when I closed a system, it stayed closed. This is a settlement offer, I began, my voice steady and low. I have no interest in seeing you in a bankruptcy proceeding, Evan. It's messy, it's public, and it would ultimately affect the trust I've set up for my grandson. So, I'm offering you a clean exit. I slid the thick envelope toward him. The equity group I represent is prepared to purchase your remaining interest in the 4th Street Plaza. The price is exactly enough to satisfy your outstanding commercial loans and pay off the penalties to the city. You walk away with 0 debt on that project. Evan opened the envelope, his fingers trembling. He scanned the numbers. This is pennies on the dollar, Harold. I've put 5 years of my life into that development. This doesn't even cover my personal investment. Your personal investment was lost the moment you decided to use a family home as a bargaining chip, I said. I leaned forward, the light from the overhead lamp casting a sharp shadow across the table. You're not negotiating for a profit, Evan. You're negotiating for your survival. If you don't sign this by tonight, the bank will move for a full liquidation on Monday morning. You know as well as I do that once the sharks smell the salt in the water, they don't stop until the bone is bare. Marlene reached out and touched the paper, her voice a sharp hiss. This is extortion. You're taking advantage of a temporary setback to rob us. I turned my gaze to her. A temporary setback is a clogged drain, Marlene. What you have is a structural collapse. And you didn't just rob me, you tried to erase my son. You tried to take a child away from his father because he didn't fit your aesthetic. That carries a very high price. Talia spoke then, her voice quiet but clear. He's right, Mom. Marlene turned on her daughter, her eyes wide with shock. Talia, how can you say that? We did everything for you. We built that life for you. No, Talia said, looking up at her mother for the first time. You built it for yourselves. You just used me as the wallpaper. I didn't even know about the repayment agreement you forced Lucas to sign. I didn't know you were using our house to fund Dad's projects. You didn't protect me, you leveraged me. The room went silent. It was the sound of the last support beam snapping. Evan looked at his daughter, then at the papers, and finally at me. He looked like a man who had been staring at a blueprint his whole life only to realize he had been holding it upside down. If I sign this, Evan said, his voice a mere shadow of its former self, what happens to the Brookside house? It stays in the trust, I said. Lucas and Talia can live there as long as they maintain the residency requirements. But you and Marlene will have no legal right to enter that property. No keys, no codes, no unannounced visits to check on the welfare of the child. You are officially removed from the schematic. You can't keep us away from our grandson, Marlene said, though the conviction was gone from her voice. I don't have to, I said. The court order already did that. I'm just providing the physical barrier to ensure the order is respected. I've spent my life keeping the outside air from ruining the inside climate. I'm very good at it. I slid a pen across the table. It was a heavy silver pen, the kind of tool Evan liked to use. He picked it up. He stared at the signature line for a long time. I watched the clock on the wall. The second hand ticked with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. Every tick was a reminder that time was a resource he no longer possessed. He looked at Marlene, seeking some sign of strength, but she was looking at the floor, her shoulders slumped. He looked at Talia, but she was looking at me. Evan signed the document. The sound of the pen on the paper was a soft, scratching noise, like a mouse behind a baseboard. He pushed the folder back toward me, his hand lingering on the edge of the table for a moment before he pulled it away. There, he said. It's done. Are you satisfied? I'm not looking for satisfaction, Evan, I said, closing the folder and placing it in my briefcase. I'm looking for stability. And now that the pressure has been released, we can finally begin the cooling process. I stood up. The meeting was over. There was no need for a closing statement or a dramatic exit. The machinery had done its job. The components had been replaced. The flow had been restored to its proper channels. I led them to the door. As they stepped out onto the porch, the night air was cool and crisp. Evan stopped for a moment, looking back at the house. He looked like he wanted to say something, a final insult, a plea, perhaps even an apology, but the words wouldn't come. There was no room for them in the system I had built. One more thing, Evan, I said, holding the door. He turned, a flicker of hope or fear in his eyes. The 4th Street Plaza, I said. The equity group is going to finish the project. They've asked me to oversee the mechanical installs. I'm going to make sure that emergency valve is replaced with something that actually works. It's important to have a fail-safe, don't you think? He didn't answer. He turned and walked toward the sedan, his movements slow and deliberate. Marlene followed him, her heels no longer clicking with authority, but rather a dull, heavy thud. Talia stayed behind for a second, looking at me. Is Lucas okay? She asked. He's better than he was at the gas station, I said. He's at home. He's with his son. The rest is up to you. She nodded once, a quick, sharp movement, and then walked to the car. I watched them drive away, their taillights disappearing into the darkness of the suburban street. I stood on the porch for a long time, breathing in the scent of the night. It felt clean. The vibration that had been rattling through my life for the last few months had finally stopped. I went back inside and locked the door. I didn't use the decorative hardware. I used the heavy-duty lock bolt I had installed myself. It clicked into place with a solid, reassuring sound. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. I looked at the dining room table, now empty of folders and pens. It was just a piece of furniture again. The house was just a house. I felt a profound sense of exhaustion, the kind that comes after a 48-hour shift in a heat wave. But beneath the tiredness, there was a steady, cool current of peace. My family was secure. My son was no longer a ghost in his own life. My grandson had a foundation that wouldn't shift under his feet. I went to my office and sat down at the desk. I opened my ledger and found the entry for the Brookside property. I picked up a pen and drew a single, straight line through the notes I had made over the last few weeks. System restored. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. The silence was absolute. There were no more leaks to find, no more cracks to seal. The job was finished. But as I sat there in the dark, I thought about the 4th Street Plaza. I thought about the way the steel looked against the sky and the way the air would move through the new vents. I thought about the way things could be built to last if you just took the time to do it right from the beginning. I would start the new specs on Monday. For now, I would just listen to the quiet. The finality of a completed project isn't found in the celebration, it's found in the silence that follows the last turn of the wrench. On Monday morning, I stood in the driveway of the Brookside house. The neighborhood was waking up, the sound of sprinklers and distant garage doors creating a suburban white noise that felt stable, even rhythmic. I wasn't there to fix a furnace or check a thermostat. I was there to witness the atmosphere. The front door opened and Lucas stepped out onto the porch. He was wearing a clean shirt and he held a steaming mug in one hand. He looked at the yard, then at the street, and finally at me. There was no longer a shadow behind his eyes. The haunted, frantic energy of the man I had found at the gas station had been replaced by a quiet, grounded presence. He walked down the steps and met me by my truck. "It's quiet, Dad," he said, leaning against the fender. "I haven't heard from them. Not a text, not an email. The lawyers said the paperwork was finalized on their end late Friday night." "The pressure has been removed, Lucas," I said. I looked at the house I had reclaimed, the house that now sat securely in a trust that no one could manipulate. When you remove the source of the vibration, the structure stops rattling. It's basic physics. "Talia is upstairs," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "She's packing her things, not because she has to go, but because she says she needs to move into the guest room for a while. She said she needs to learn how to live in a house that isn't a museum for her father's ego. She started looking for a job that doesn't involve her parents' firm." I nodded. That was the one variable I couldn't calculate, the human element. But I had provided the environment. If the conditions were right, the repair could take hold. If not, the structure would at least remain standing for the boy. "I'm heading to the 4th Street site," I said, checking my watch. "The new equity group wants a full audit of the mechanical systems before the new crews start. I'm going to make sure every joint is sealed and every valve is rated for double the expected load." "Are you ever going to stop working, Dad?" Lucas asked, a small smile touching his face. "Everything requires maintenance, Lucas. The moment you stop looking for the leaks is the moment they start to form. I'll see you for dinner on Sunday." I drove away, watching him in the rearview mirror until he turned back toward his front door. I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with the money I had saved or the property I had secured. It was the feeling of a job done according to the specifications. I had promised him a foundation, and I had delivered it. The 4th Street Plaza was a hive of activity when I arrived. The stop work order had been lifted an hour earlier, and the sound of pneumatic hammers and backup beepers filled the air. It was a productive noise. I walked into the construction trailer and found Miller sitting at the desk, looking 10 years younger than he had on Tuesday. "Pierce," he said, nodding toward a roll of blueprints. "The new owners sent over the revised specs. They want you to have final sign-off on the entire HVAC and plumbing grid. They said they want it bulletproof." "That's the only way I work," I said. I took the prints and walked into the main structure. The concrete was cold and gray, but the steel was true. I spent 3 hours climbing the ladders and checking the hangars. I reached the basement level, the heart of the building, where the main water line entered the facility. I stood before the faulty valve, the one that had been the pivot point for Evan Calders' collapse. It was still there, rusted and brittle, a small piece of negligence that could have ruined a $100 million investment. I reached into my bag and pulled out a heavy-duty pipe wrench. I adjusted the jaw, feeling the familiar grip of the tool. With a sharp, controlled motion, I broke the seal. The sound of the metal giving way was a loud, echoing crack that resonated through the empty basement. I removed the old valve and set it on the floor. It looked pathetic in the light of my flashlight. A cheap, thin-walled component that never should have been installed in a building of this size. I replaced it with a new one. This one was brass and stainless steel, heavy enough to feel like an anchor. I tightened the bolts in a cross pattern, ensuring the pressure was distributed equally across the gasket. When I was finished, I turned the main supply wheel. The water surged into the line with a low, powerful hum. I watched the gauge. The needle climbed steadily and then stopped, rock solid, at the precise operating pressure. No leaks, no vibration, no compromise. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the cool metal of the pipe. I thought about Evan and Marlene. I thought about the way they had tried to use the subtle, invisible pressures of social standing and financial leverage to dismantle my family. They had thought they were the architects. They had thought they were the ones who decided the load-bearing capacity of a man's dignity. They were wrong. I gathered my tools and walked out of the basement. I climbed the stairs to the street level and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. The city was moving, the traffic a steady flow of energy and intent. Across the street, I saw a familiar black sedan idling near the corner. It was Evan. He was sitting in the back seat, staring up at the building he no longer owned. He looked like a man watching a ghost. I didn't wave, I didn't acknowledge him. I walked to my truck, placed my tools in their designated bins, and closed the tailgate. The sound of the latch was a final, definitive click. I sat in the driver's seat and looked at the building one last time. It was a good project. It would stand for 50 years, maybe more. It would hold its temperature in the winter and stay cool in the summer. It would function exactly as it was designed to. I pulled out my phone and deleted the photos of the old valve. I deleted the records of the bank inquiries. I deleted the notes on the Calder Property Group's debt cycles. I didn't need the leverage anymore. The job was signed off. The system was closed. I put the truck in gear and pulled into the flow of traffic. I had a service call on the other side of town, a grocery store with a walk-in freezer that was running 5 degrees too warm. It was a small job, a simple matter of a clogged condenser coil, but it needed to be done. As I drove, I looked at the reflection of my own eyes in the rearview mirror. They were calm. The thermostat was set. The air was clear. I reached over and turned on the radio. A jazz station was playing something with a steady, walking bass line. I tapped my fingers on the steering wheel, keeping time with the rhythm. I thought about the gas station at 2:00 a.m. I thought about the sound of my grandson's breath in the quiet of my guest room. I thought about the way the light had looked on the new locks at the Brookside house. Some people think that revenge is a fire. They think it's something that burns hot and leaves nothing but ash. But they're wrong. Real revenge is a cooling system. It's the process of removing the heat until everything is stable. It's the act of bringing the temperature down until the world is exactly the way you want it to be. I reached the grocery store and parked in the loading zone. I grabbed my bag and headed toward the back entrance. I didn't look back at the city or the plaza or the ghosts of the people who had tried to break my family. I had work to do, and in my world, work is the only thing that lasts. I walked through the heavy plastic curtains of the loading dock, the cool air of the warehouse hitting my face like a greeting. I didn't need to check the map. I knew exactly where the malfunction was. I knew exactly how to fix it, and I knew exactly when to stop. The door behind me swung shut, the hydraulic closer pulling it into the frame with a soft, muffled thud. The sound was final. The system was balanced. The job was done.